Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Chi Association, and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe. Educational Alpha is sponsored by iCapital, the financial technology company with the mission to power the world's alternative investment marketplace. Part innovator, part educator, and part navigator of the alternatives industry, iCapital offers intuitive, scalable digital solutions that have transformed how private market and hedge fund investments are bought and sold. With iCapital, financial advisors, wealth managers, and asset managers around the world now have access to everything they need to deliver the return and diversification potential of alternatives to high net worth investors. To learn more, visit iCapital.com.
In this episode, Bill welcomes Robin Fabiano, an experienced educator and administrator. They discuss the crucial issue of mental health in the educational sector, focusing on its effects on students and teachers. The conversation includes insights into the changing landscape of mental health challenges, the role of social media, and strategies for improving mental health support in schools. Listen in.
Robin Fabiano, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Thank you. Great to be here.
My pleasure. So I should probably start with a disclaimer and a disclosure. You've been a friend of mine and a friend of my family's for 30 years. I think it does stretch back that long. So if there's a conflict of interest embedded in there, so be it. But you've been a consummate professional too, and I know a little bit about your professional life. And I want to use that as a wedge to talk about this epidemic of unhappiness and mental health. And you're at ground zero in the formative years of education, but maybe a little bit on your background. And then I think there's a lot of very interesting and timely topics to cover there.
Sure, thanks. So, Bill, you and I met when I was a special education teacher, and I was in that role for about 15 years before moving into education administration. I was the director of an elementary district and then moved to the high school level. And that's where I currently am now. I'm a district-wide administrator for students 9 through 12, and then a transition program 18 to 22 in a large school district. So the high school setting has around 2,500 students, which in the Boston area is one of our larger districts. And I love my job. I spend a lot of time thinking about how to support students, how to support teachers. And I've been in the field since 1995. I serve on many boards, and I'm also a podcast host as well in an educational podcast topic. And we can plug that later on if it comes up naturally. And I'm really happy to be here. I think we have been struggling with the topic of mental health for a really long time. And I love learning about how mental health impacts the economy. So it's something I had not connected in a real way before you and I had the conversation. And so I'm excited about this topic.
And there was an article in Barron's, I think, when we were speaking at some point, maybe back in October, and I think that was the genesis of this idea. But maybe to start a little bit at the beginning for me, so you know this, the audience doesn't necessarily know, but I've got 5 kids. My son Max is pretty severely disabled. He's 29 years old, living in a group home. And we met when he was just starting, I think, kindergarten, and he came out of the early intervention program to try to give him some supports. And maybe back then, my definition of mental disabilities or being mentally disabled was somebody like Max that needed a lot of support, both personally and in the classroom. And our goal was always to try to get him to a safe place. And that's where he is now. And we're very, very happy with how things have turned out for him. He's earned an IEP, he was given great care, et cetera, et cetera. But I always made the observation that if you're a medium performing student with whatever challenges, the system allows you just to kind of cruise along without any intervention. So I think these public schools in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are excellent by and large. And your ability to get a very, very good education is there for the taking. But if you want to sit back and cruise, you could do that too, unless you're somebody like Max that really needs this intervention. I think where we are now is that we have the high performing students and we have the students like Max. But I think this middle cohort is getting wider and deeper. And what prompted this, and I'll reference this article for the audience, it was David Blanchflower, who's a labor economist at Dartmouth. And he was interviewed in Barron's about this epidemic of unhappiness. And I was very unhappy and very, very sad after I read that article. And there were just a couple of stats in there that you can react to. One, it's not COVID necessarily, although that had to play some role in terms of the 4 or 5 years worth of students that were either left out of the classroom for a year or however we want to describe that. But he talked about two things. And I think I got this from his article, but I read this somewhere. 42 of the state attorney generals are suing Meta, which is the owner of Facebook and Instagram, because they've ensnared children into their zone, and the detriment to their health, I think, is pretty well documented. I'm not sure where that case stands. I think it was brought in October. But equally alarming, and I know this stat was in his article, they did some survey research. And one of the cohorts they looked at, I don't know why they picked this cohort, but it was 23-year-old women. And 12% of them, 12% of 23-year-old women reported every single day is a bad mental health day. And I'm saying, oh my God, this is a problem that is staring us right in the face. And I think the economic impacts of this, which was Blanche Flower's thesis, are going to be enormous. So I'm not suggesting, Robin, that you have the answers, but you're kind of at ground zero in the formative years, and maybe some of your observations about the impact of social media, the impact of COVID. I don't know if bullying is still alive and well. I assume it is, but maybe it's now more of the digital variety as opposed to getting beaten up on the playground. But maybe some of your observations there could maybe at least shine a little bit of a light on this area.
Sure. So when I first entered the field, the statistics that we thought of for percentage of students with severe disabilities, so again, students like Max in that range, were about 1% to 2% of the total population had what was called a severe disability. And then if you thought about students with learning disabilities, it would be less than 10%. And now we're looking at eligibility rates of students and of districts of like 20 to 25% of the population falls under the umbrella of an educational disability. And the highest level of need at this point are students with social emotional needs. And yes, you can just cruise through school, and parents and caregivers and teachers are identifying students with mental health needs at such a high rate at this point that special education can like barely keep up with the requirements and the needs of the students. And so we're really looking at what can be offered at the general education level to help support kids before they would qualify. I think that translates to what's going on as these youngsters get to adulthood and what their outcomes look like. And so I'll make another pivot. Same thing in the early years, in the early 90s and early 2000s, we were identifying kids with autism at a really high rate. I think we all remember those conversations. Like first you knew one person with autism and now you know like 30 people with autism. And we used to say to the adult agency and to people running vocational programs, you need to be ready for this wave of autistic people who are going to be entering the workforce and who will support them. And now they're here, right? These people are in their 20s. They need to contribute. They need to work. They have lots of good skills. And still the rate of unemployment for people with disabilities, people with mental health, people with autism, people with invisible disabilities is like double to what a traditional statistic for the unemployment rate would be. And so I think we have this population of people with a lot of needs, and we're just not sure how to support them as they get older. And what was interesting to me in the article we read was the economic impact of people not working and people not contributing to the economy, people not being able to buy homes at the same rate we used to. And all of that is something that I haven't thought about in my educational world. I've certainly thought about how to prepare students better to make sure the outcomes are what they want for themselves and we want. But I was really struck by it's like the chicken and the egg effect of if we're not consuming, the economy is not working in the way it needs to.
And you mentioned housing, and it's also relationships and couples coming together and having children and population at least maintaining. And our demographics, the world is shrinking. China's in a net decline. Our demographics are a little bit better than that, but not great. And then you're absolutely right. We've got a housing market that's always counted on the next generation to take the prior generation out. And that liquidity window can and will perhaps look very different. So I don't know what the sea change was, Robin. Maybe it was the murder of George Floyd, but DE&I has been very topical for the right reasons. But I wonder, from your vantage point, when it comes to the disabled population, have they found their home inside of the DE&I nest? And if you think about this generation and they want to be employed, but how the employer embraces them and understands maybe some of their challenges, it is a diverse set of individuals that may have very, very different needs, can maybe be very, very productive, but how you get them onto the grid is going to be difficult.
Right. So I think there are visible and invisible disabilities. And so for those who have visible disabilities, you can really count on this generation being open to helping their neighbors and their communities. And yes, we're willing to take interns. We're willing to make our communities more inclusive. We see that with higher education, right? People with developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities are being socially included on college campuses, which is great. We see that in entry level jobs, that there are people with intellectual disabilities having like a higher entry point. I would say because those employers were the first generation of classmates with that first wave of inclusive education, and that's what we wanted, right? To like make a seed change in our community. I think the invisible disabilities are much harder. It depends on whether or not you are able to disclose and want to disclose your disability, and there's stigma still. I think it depends on what type of accommodations you need. It depends on funding for accommodations. And I think that DEI is less about disabilities and more about race and ethnicity than disabilities at this point. And I see them as unfortunately separate, at least in the organizations that I've been working with at this point. I want to say, I also feel that the students that are here today and the younger people are looking for less traditional experiences, and our schools haven't caught up with that yet. And so our schools are still generating this like highly traditional sit in our class for 60 minutes, study these things that maybe are not as connected to what the young are looking for in terms of social justice and ability to synthesize information and like have these debates. And traditional education is not where they're getting all of their like joy from. And we don't have enough vocational seats. We don't have enough non-traditional programs. I think kids during COVID probably were disenchanted with the educational experience they got online, didn't see the value, and haven't bounced back from it in a way that we thought, because again, we're now trying to get them back in the classroom, sitting in these really highly traditional experiences that they're just not motivated to participate in.
I think this is a good thing, but I want to get your reaction as well. So, as a parent, we had our first child, Sam, turn a teenager in 2003. And my youngest son, Will, is 19. So he'll be out of the teenage years for the first time later this year, but having had at least one teenage child for 21 years. So it doesn't make us an expert, but I can see sort of trends and changes. And I will say, from my vantage point, and I don't think my kids are unique in this regard, this generation, Will's generation, I don't know what they call them these days, Z, X, I lose track of these monikers, but they seem to be much more open and transparent. And you mentioned stigma before. It still exists, but I don't think it exists the same way. So I think if there's a good thing, I think this generation is a bit more open, maybe not open enough to ask for help, to seek help. And I don't know if that's your observation or not. There's still a lot of work to be done, but if they recognize and are willing to be open about it, I think at least that's a positive step.
I agree. And I'll start by saying, Bill, if Rocco is even a quarter as wonderful as your kids, I would be thrilled. So you guys are my goal. And I think about that when I make decisions for what Rocco's doing. you're right that this generation is more open, but they're not the employers. They're not the people giving them jobs and making the decisions. And so I'm being really stereotypical when I give this scenario. But if you are a disheveled, purpled haired, highly tattooed person that goes in to get a loan and you are sitting in front of a very traditional loan officer, I think there's going to be some judgment there. And I think we have experienced that. Black people have experienced that. People from other cultures have experienced that and haven't gotten the same opportunities than a white person has. And now people with disabilities and mental health issues are experiencing that too. And I don't think that stigma has gone away, unfortunately.
No, and I think you're right. If anything, it's probably getting worse before it gets better. And I think an important reminder about accepting and understanding all differences. So I think it's a very good point. So maybe as a segue to what are we doing about this as a world and as a country, and probably in your day job, you pay very little attention to what's going on in Davos, Switzerland. But this is the week of the World Economic Forum. And I had to Google it again. I know about it, and it's all these world leaders and Fortune 500 CEOs all fly into Davos and probably more to ski than anything else. But the World Economic Forum is theoretically there to get these leaders together to debate pressing global problems and ideally seek solutions. I don't know if they seek solutions between slaloms down the hill, but that's what the goal is. And I don't know for the first time, but I checked the agenda just today in anticipation of this discussion. And one of the things on the agenda are a human change campaign. And they are insisting that the world make children's mental health a priority. And they're putting a lot of it at the doorstep of digitalization. And I didn't study this closely. I don't think they really mentioned COVID all that much, but getting down to even regulating tech to protect the future generation. And again, having had some experience with kids, they always have their nose into social media, even at the dinner table. And if you look at a platform like Instagram, very few people are posting pictures that are sad or upsetting. It's all about the filter and how wonderful and how great it is. And I think that contributes to it as well, because if that's the benchmark and the average person's average, and let's be honest, we're all average. We all have our issues and challenges. But if you are led to believe that is the paradigm, and maybe for young women, it's harder than young men, but it seems like this whole digital approach and digital maybe interaction at such a young age is going to prove to be a pretty unhealthy thing.
So we've heard young people say, I don't want to have kids because I'm scared to bring kids up in this world. Or I don't want to go to college because I'm so scared of what the outcome is going to be for me. And I think there's this paralyzing escape that happens. And that's why we see school refusal so high right now. And we see kids who are so unhappy is because they're just so worried about what is available to them in their next stage of their life. And so it's almost like crippling anxiety. And once that happens, you just freeze, right? That's like one strategy when you're anxious is just to avoid the whole thing and not do anything. And so it's almost like trying to delay what could possibly happen. And I think that what's going on in the world is contributing to how kids are feeling. And although I don't follow whatever acronym you just said, I do follow like Finland as an educational example of them producing really healthy and well-rounded and productive kids. And they always speak to their relationships and their culture and their society and how they treat each other as a protective factor and how one factor of how kids are successful. And so that is something that I truly believe that we need to do in our schools, but our schools are just like a microcosm of our larger community. And so I can set up all of these wonderful allyships and affinity groups, and then the kid goes home or goes to a job or like turns on the news and sees chaos. That's the world they're experiencing. And I think it's super scary for people, for sure. Social media is like a whole crazy dynamic. We see kids making really poor judgments around things that they post, interactions, what they say. I also see this with adults. And Bill, I don't know if you do also, or if you're hearing this. I mean, the way people are communicating with each other online as adults is really scary and has lots of impact on how people feel safe in their jobs and how they are feeling like they can solve problems together and collaborate with each other. In terms of social media, I think the gaming system and the gaming culture of this fighting and talking to strangers and feeling comfortable just like saying these just horrible things to each other online and having no impact because you don't know the person on the other side is really troubling. And I don't think we have enough parental support. I don't think they have the tools. And I'm positive we don't have the tools to really have time to teach that etiquette and how to respond in these really challenging situations where someone says like the N word to someone and you're like, you don't even know the person across the screen from you. It's really troubling. And I definitely think that social media plays a big role in this. I was aware of the lawsuit that is going on. I don't know if Massachusetts is one of the states that signed on. That's something that we should do a little digging on. I think like Oregon or Washington were one of the first states, and we looked at that too. And then I didn't pick up like how many other states and the order in which people were signing on to that lawsuit. I think it's really interesting. And I'm wondering what the outcome is going to be. And I don't know what to do about fake book. I find it too. My kid is tantruming one moment and then he does something great and I post that. And I don't post the tantrum for sure.
So we're contributing to it a little bit ourselves, but I guess that's what parents have to do for our own sanity. So one more thing on this theme, Robin. So I mentioned this economic forum in Davos, and it was interesting. One of the speakers was, again, I don't know his specialty, but he's faculty or on staff at Boston Children's Hospital, a world-class institution very close to where you and I both live. And I assume he was a doctor of some kind, psychologist, psychiatrist, I forget. But when they described his background, Children's Hospital in Boston has a digital wellness lab. I was blown away by that. Are you aware of that? And do you know what goes on there?
So there are experts that are studying like the impact of social media. There's also, I don't know if it got into the DSM-5 yet, but like a social media addiction is something that we're hearing about as, I don't want to say a disability. It may be at this point, but it's very similar to like the impact of marijuana. So now we're getting reports from people that say like the neurological impact of marijuana, and we're supposed to now consider that as a disability and program for students who are addicted to smoking weed all day. And really, for me, the treatment is go into treatment program. Like as an educational person, I'm not sure how I have the tools to fix that. And so these organizations are coming up with diagnosing kids as addicts and then trying to put limits on students, trying to write curriculum around social media safety and how to perspective take when you're not able to see someone's nonverbal presentation. It's interesting. It's a new field for both of those. I'm curious to see what's going to happen. But sure, there are people studying this and coming and doing workshops with teachers to help identify different strategies for when kids are addicted. We just did this year a no cell phone policy for our ninth graders because kids were so distracted by their phones that we couldn't tolerate them in school. So we just eliminated them at all for ninth graders.
Do the parents support that?
We didn't get a lot of pushback, which is interesting. I think people were grateful that we were trying to do something. I'm sure that the parents find that their own kids, as you said, cell phones at the dinner table, right? I do it too. And I'm guilty of my cell phone being at the table. And I think they were grateful that we were trying to put a limit on something like that.
No, I think it's great. Yeah, you mentioned a moment ago, Robin, digital addiction. And I saw this term too in just some of the, I'm not an expert, just some of the very quick research I was doing. And I also saw the word despair. And I don't know if despair is on the depression spectrum. Again, you might have a comment on that. But this is another frightening stat. They talked about the death rates due to despair. So it's sort of this nebulous, what does that mean, death rates due to despair? But studies have shown despair kills people at a higher rate than drugs, alcohol, and even suicide. So that is equally frightening that we have this generation of unhappiness that is probably correlated to despair and maybe some form of depression. Is it proper to look at it as an addiction, just like alcohol or drugs or any other substance?
I mean, that's what people are comparing it to, is that type of addiction. And we have these young kids, 8, 9, 10 years old, that are addicted to social media. It starts very young. In terms of the despair, So schools, we take data on our students. We have a lot of measures, both internally and like from the state and from the federal government around different questionnaires that we give out to track students and their social emotional status. So we have stats going back for 10 years around the status of students. And there is a protective measure that can alter or counterbalance all of this like despair and hopelessness. And that's one trusted adult. And you would think that it would be easy to find one trusted adult for students to be connected with, and it's not. When you survey students and you ask them, do you have one trusted adult in school? Majority of them say no. And that is sad, right? I mean, that's not their teacher, that's not a guidance counselor. And so a lot of our outreach for protective measures for exactly this is trying to connect with students and making sure like every day you say, hello, how are you? See kids, you know their names, you can know something about them. And just that connectedness makes a huge difference because suicide and suicidal ideation is fleeting. I mean, yes, people can contemplate it for months, but the impulse is fleeting and it's incredibly quick to like pull the trigger on that. And so what people try to do again is to make sure that there are enough positive interactions with kids a day that could counterbalance this impulsive move that could really be devastating.
Oh, well. So one more question in this, then I'm going to throw you a big fat pitch on your podcast. So you and I have a very close friend, and I'm not going to name her, but she was an excellent teacher. This is all she wanted to do. She loved it. And then for all we've talked about for these last 30 minutes, it was overwhelming to her. And she physically could not get out of bed in the morning and continue to do this. And she left the field. And I think this is an example of one person that was destined to do what she was doing, and she's not doing it anymore. And I wish that were an isolated case, but I don't think that it is. So maybe the current state of play of you and people that are out there at the face of this, and all you're dealing with probably very, very limited support and stretching budget dollars as far as you can go. Are we doing enough to support the teachers out there?
There was that fleeting moment in COVID where teachers were put on the pedestal. Oh, you do so much. You're working so hard. You're at home with your kids and pivoting online. And then I think there was a moment that maybe parents saw what was going on online and thought, is this really worth it? Like, what are they really doing? My kid's not motivated. There must be something that's wrong with what the teacher is doing. And then very quickly, schools and teachers and education were put in the position to hold all of the blame and the outcome of COVID. So we closed schools. We didn't open soon enough. We didn't have enough resources. We're not providing enough social emotional support. Like we can't stop the social media addiction. Students are fighting and we can't stop it. And so I think there were a lot of expectations put back on schools very quickly that they really aren't prepared for and aren't built for. And it set everyone up for a lot of disappointment. And certainly for the person that we know, the class makeup was really hard and they didn't have the support that they needed. And really that looks like the students didn't have the support that they needed, right? You had really challenged kids that were really acting out in class, I mean, tantruming, wrecking her classroom, and she didn't have the support she needed. And I think that there are a lot of teachers out there that are facing this exact situation. The teacher prep programs are not filling in the same way. I don't think teaching is a desirable job in terms of payment, scheduling, right? It used to be, and actually, when you plug my podcast, there is a podcast on the history of teaching and how women entered the field and why women entered the field, because it used to be a highly preferred job for men, right? Males were educators and it was a status job. But over time, it changed and it became a job where just women for a short, finite amount of time worked until they themselves had kids and stayed home. And then again, that evolved and changed. And so I think it's just not a desirable job anymore. And we put a lot of emphasis on education and what you need to do to become a teacher, right? You need a master's degree. Sometimes you need additional certifications. You need to pass state tests to become licensed. You need to maintain that license. Sometimes you need to have a second master's if you want to be a special ed teacher versus a general education teacher or a math teacher. You need more education. And all of that input, you don't get the same output in terms of salary and recognition and status. And there are no bonuses and blah, blah, blah. You know all of this, and it's all online also. But it's a tough profession. And I don't see it getting any easier. And I don't see many people wanting to be a teacher these days, or people encouraging their kids to be teachers. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'm interested in the next 20 years to see what our field looks like and how it evolves.
Well, I think we have to, as a society, take a closer look at the model. We certainly haven't solved for anything today, Robin, but I think you've helped underscore some of the challenges, and maybe that's maybe a small win. So you beat me to it with the podcast reference, but I'm going to allow you more or less unfettered access to talk it up, and maybe start at the name of it, how old it is, why you started it in the first place, what you're trying to accomplish.
Sure. So the name of the podcast is A Special Education Teacher, an Administrator, and a Lawyer Walk into a Bar. All you ever wanted to know about special education. It started right after COVID. It was something that I had been thinking about for a while. And it was a COVID project of mine to learn how to start a podcast. And so I taught myself, opened the internet, like watched the YouTube videos. And my two co-hosts are people I've worked with for a long time. One is a school attorney and the other is another administrator. And we used to joke about recording our conversations when we were out for drinks. And we really just formalized it. And we have, I think, highly educational, but friendly and fun and user-friendly conversations around special education. They're informative. They also are lighthearted. We have interviews with important people. And Bill, you were a guest on our show talking about your experience as a dad of a young man with special needs. And we also have moms on, and we really wanted to highlight how dads are impacted by having kids with special needs also in that lens. We try to reach educators, administrators, and parents. We have a great following. We're on season 4. And we have followers all over the world, which is really cool. So we get emails from Kuwait, and they ask us questions about things that are going on there. And so that's been really fun to like reach people outside of Massachusetts and hear what's going on in their world.
Just to put a metric on it, do you track downloads?
We do. So we average between like 500 and 700 downloads a week. We drop on Fridays. We're on a hiatus right now. We started recording again also. So we're going to be dropping our first episode next week. And in this perspective, because I think we're delayed, Bill. So this would be at the end of January that we're starting up again. And yeah, we're close to like over 50,000 downloads total, which is pretty cool.
Wow, outstanding. And do you have a sponsor?
I don't have a sponsor, and I wish I could get one. And so if anyone's listening and they want to sponsor our podcast, please reach out. This is something that we've been doing on the side, and I do all the editing myself, which is something that I'm interested in doing. And all of the downloads have been grassroots. We have no social media. We don't have anyone helping us. And I'd like to think that if we did, we could really make even a broader impact than what we're doing now.
I can relate to some of that, but without Paulina, who's behind the scenes, and Susie, I'd be nowhere. This started as a Skunks Works project, and they've been awesome helping us not only get this done from a technology standpoint, but they and Kai as an association, we're not for profit ourselves. They've been very good at getting it out there. But I will say, based on those downloads and those numbers, Robin, it's outstanding what you've been able to accomplish. And you should have a sponsor. Somebody should be willing, if nothing else, to support what we've talked about for the last 35 minutes and help get that message from Melrose, Massachusetts to Kuwait and every precinct in between. So I'll do what I can to see how I could help there. But congratulations on getting that word out.
Thank you.
So this has been informative. I said we talked a lot, maybe more socially than professionally, but I did learn a few things. I think the topic is educational alpha, and try to teach our listeners about something they're less aware of. And there are investment opportunities and then real life opportunities. And I think there's some opportunities that you've mentioned where it's incumbent upon us as just global citizens to make it our business to get involved and maybe starting to listen to your podcast or just get yourself a little bit more familiar with what's happening in this next generation. Because if they don't come up as at least active and hopefully thriving citizens, it's not good for the global economy.
Right. And I think you've opened my eyes in terms of what the impact of the contribution is. And so I take the transition outside of high school really seriously and looking at post outcomes. And I'm even more aware of it now. And I think this is information I'm actually going to take back to our teams as well, because we can certainly weave in to the students when we're teaching them around next steps. I think this is good data for them to know also around what their impact is.
Terrific. Well, Robin, thanks for your insights today and certainly for all that you do in your day job. It's a tall ask and you do it so well. So appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, great to see you.
Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the CAIA Association and subscribe to the show at caia.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.